Congratulations, Stephen. And Lieutenant, thank you so much, not only for your service to the city, but also in modeling what the people in whom we place our trust really should be doing with that trust. And we're very excited, I think I can speak for both of us, to be able to join you guys in conversation, to lift up some of the themes that really resonated with us as jurors, and we really hope that all of you take the opportunity to see the film if you haven't already. It is a truly inspirational work of art. It's a truly moving testimony to activism and advocacy. And I think one of the themes that both Pat and I were very interested in bringing to this conversation was how art and activism intersect. As you heard from John, the Gill Prize honors a really diverse collection of art every year in what we consider. We have honored pieces of theater, we've honored a graphic novel last year, we've honored pieces of architecture and landscape architecture. There have been films in the past. You're not the first filmmaker to win this award, but you are in great company. Rudy Burkhart got the very first Gill Prize. But I think this really sort of testifies to not only just the beauty of the way in which New York is evoked as an aspirational place that brings out the best in us, hopefully, but also a place that is in constant need of people saying the right thing and standing up for what they believe in.
And I just want to say how very, very pleased we are to be here at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. It's so fitting, given what the subject of the film is and what your filmmaking is about, to do this here. And I want to thank both the Municipal Art Society for making the decision to do this in Harlem at this incredible place, because it is resonant with the issues that call out for social justice and artistic contributions. So both of those things are symbolically seen as we sit here today. So thank you for this.
So, Stephen, if I could start with you, if you could just give us a little bit of background on how this film came to be, how you came to be interested in this topic, and how you got to know the officers who eventually became the characters driving this story.
Sure. Well, first off, I just have to say thank you so much to the Municipal Arts Society and Schomburg Center. This is an incredible honor. You know, this film in its totality was 7 years in the making, and it would be remiss for me to not point out that Ross Tuttle, my longtime producer and friend in this project right here. Please stand up, Ross. We've been on this journey together over the last 7 years, and this film doesn't exist without him. Actually, my mom, my biggest supporter, and our close family friends are here, and my fiance Trina and my little baby girl Rosie is here, so also my biggest supporters. So yeah, so this film would never have been able to have been made on its first attempt. Ross and I had made several shorts about policing, stop and frisk, discriminatory practices in the NYPD. And then a 1-hour piece about the same subject. And what happened over the course of those projects was that two of the anonymous cops that we had been filming with, which we were introduced to by an attorney representing them in the Floyd versus City of New York stop and frisk case, they became integral members of what would become the NYPD 12. So we had no idea that what started out as an introduction by way of an attorney that Ross had known would then snowball into a group of 12 officers that were prepared to do what nobody in the history of the department had ever done, which is hold this department accountable for illegal quota practices and the violation of the 14th Amendment. And so what happened was that in brief, there was a lot of restlessness around the year of 2014, a new mayor elected on a reform platform, and these officers decided that they did not want to just appear anonymously in our work anymore. And I was really, coming from a cinema verite background, I very much wanted to do a deep, like, human scale observational film that would really document this process of lamplighting, blowing the whistle on such an explosive issue. And they were very willing and ready to do so.
So can you say just a little bit more about some of your previous projects? You mentioned that you come from a verite film background, but you've also worked in video journalism as well as other kinds of contexts. So tell me a little bit about some prior projects that maybe set the stage for this endeavor.
Sure. So I've looked at issues of censorship. I did a 5-year observational film in mainland China about two of the nation's first citizen journalists traveling the countryside there, reporting uncensored news at great risk. I've done pieces about State Department leakers who were charged with violating the Espionage Act for having a conversation with a journalist, facing 15 to 20 years for innocuous conversations by the Department of Justice. And so I'm very much moved and inspired by people who help us remember that this idea that the systems that govern our lives are not immovable, that you can actually fight back, that the status quo does not have to be what we are, or that we don't have to be entrenched in the status quo, and that individuals like Edwin, Raymond, and the rest of the NYPD 12 and the other people in this very multi-character world are all kind of reinforcing reminders of that idea that we can actually change the system, that it actually has to be challenged, and that this idea of storytelling is so important because, it's like Mussolini said, right? The most powerful weapon is the cinema. And when there are prevailing narratives, we have to establish counter-narratives to that in order to push the conversation forward. And that's what really moves me, is when I come across unique individuals who are relatable in every sense of the word and yet are doing something exceptional.
Thank you for that. The fact that this man can speak at all, he's just come back from the rainforest today. Rainforest where?
In south of Peru.
Yes. So the fact that he's sitting and being able to speak at the same time, I'm very impressed with. But let me just say, one of the things that was actually really shocking to me about this film was the testimonies, the willingness of these 12 officers to be able to speak not only among themselves, but to you, and to trust you to tell their story. So I wanted to ask you, Lieutenant, and we're very proud of this promotion of yours, because I have to say
That deserves a round of applause.
that I was afraid for your future as I was watching the film, because I thought all of you were on the verge of crossing a line in truth-telling with your work as well that could have imperiled your livelihood, and that you wouldn't have that as an opportunity to do. So can you talk a little bit about how you and your colleagues came to trust Stephen in being able to speak out and tell truth in the way that you all have done?
Okay. First and foremost, again, thank you. This film, it's every time I see it, I still can't believe that it exists. To watch my life kind of play back in front of me. Thank you to Steve, and thank you for this honor. The way I got involved in the film, I was featured in a New York Times Magazine piece. As I signed off to the lawsuit, as a class action lawsuit with the 12 of us, and I was featured on the piece, and we had grassroots civil rights organization, the Justice League, who held a press conference to support us, because one of the things that we decided to go forward and be different is to stand shoulder to shoulder with activists who are usually protesting and speaking out against police misconduct. So to stand shoulder to shoulder with us, just the symbolism in that alone. So at the press conference, there was a lot of press already there, and out of nowhere, some guy comes up to me asking me to wear a mic. I'm like, no, I don't know you, you know? And it was Steve, and that's when one of the two officers who pioneered this, Adil Polanco and Pedro Serrano, who testified against the city in the stop and frisk trial. Their testimony was very important for the judge to make the right decision that she did. And Adil said, no, he's with us. You can trust him. And ever since then, Steve and I, we have our own, he started filming as often as he could. And we ended up with Crime and Punishment.
Great. Did you have hope that your participation in this would actually make a change in the system and in the city, especially as it relates to law enforcement?
So these systems, they're not designed for dissenting opinions from within. It's you're just a foot soldier. You get your orders and you go. But to be armed with the knowledge that I had prior to joining the police department, having front row seats to the oppression that I was observing, and yet do nothing, I felt if I simply went along to get along, that I'd personally be a fraud. So I didn't know exactly how it was that I was going to make an impact. So when the opportunity came to join the lawsuit with other officers who felt the same way I did, and then be a participant in this film, I knew the risks involved. In the film, you can see what we're going through simply for speaking out. But again, you, as a whistleblower, something clicks inside of you where you almost stop caring about yourself. You realize your contribution to society is so important. If whatever you have to endure to make it happen, it's worth it, because millions of people and the posterity will benefit. And that's what drove me.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that also makes a lot of sense in the context, Stephen, of what you just said about being drawn to risk takers and drawn to people who are willing to speak truth to power in the kinds of stories that you tell. And well, just speaking about whistleblowers and activists, I'm interested also, Stephen, in how you conceived of your role in this and how you conceived of the audience for this work. I mean, you've told me that you see your job as a filmmaker to tell, open-ended, character-driven stories, not necessarily to create works of advocacy or activism towards a specific goal. So how does that distinction inform your choices as a filmmaker, and how did that inform the process that led to Crime and Punishment?
Sure. The typical production schedule for content you might see on television or Netflix is like 4 to 6 months to turnaround time, and for me it was really important that because with this film that we had to really give the viewers an opportunity to bear witness themselves, and that if one couldn't do that, that there would not be an opportunity to actually, create a transformative experience. And I think that's what we do in all of the work we make, with all of the congratulations, by the way, to all of the wonderful recipients tonight. But when I look at that work, I think, wow, this is truly transformative. You can sense that you will enter a space and leave it a different person, and having seen the world in a different way. And that's exactly what observational filmmaking aims to do, which is allow viewers to judge for themselves, and in the literary tradition, leave spaces between the places for your own interpretation and your own conclusions to be drawn.
Which is, one of the things that I think is such a remarkable artistic achievement about the film is the way that it creates this incredible sense of intimacy with its characters. We see scenes in the officers' homes, of their families, of their lives outside of the uniform, that contrasts powerfully with the investigative aspects of filmmaking. You sort of start in the beginning, right in it with, secret recordings and kind of, fuzzy, hard to necessarily understand when you're at. There's this sort of surveillance footage, newsreel footage, during a period of, of intense public outcry about police violence nationwide, the growth of the movement for Black Lives. And I was just really struck by the sense of balance that you were able to maintain between the needs of a very intimate, character-driven documentary and a topic that's as urgent as criminal justice reform in America right now. I don't know, can you speak to how you balance those two scales of storytelling, if you will?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, you don't, you don't, like, we celebrate finished works always at events like this, and when you conceive of a project, it is never clean or ordered. It's an entirely messy, exploratory kind of situation. So it is not that, there is a sort of architected idea that just sort of starts falling into place, but there are kind of these guiding principles that I was thinking a lot about, that what we were trying to do was make visible something that had existed invisibly for decades in this city, and that, at its core, we're trying to use human experience and the human condition and the intimacy of that kind of filmmaking to speak to a higher kind of structural problem. And so, as a quick example, one of the things that I was thinking a lot about in the structuring of the film was that I've spent a long time kind of working on character-driven cinema verite style filmmaking, and yet we needed a visual system to remind viewers continuously that every time we moved to another precinct, that we would go to an aerial shot of the city looking down at a different texture of that neighborhood, and that this kind of aerial view was a literal reminder that it is not just about these moving tales of individuals, but that we have to connect the dots of the experience to understand that the entire systemic situation that each of them contribute is what is broken, and that when you think about in photography, there's a lot of this emphasis on the idea of the decisive moment, and that in criminal justice dysfunction, there is no such thing as a decisive moment. Every point of contact that individuals have in poor communities, in minority communities, exhibit these sorts of these critically problematic issues that have to be looked at, and have to be looked at systemically. So that was sort of the thinking.
No, I think I'm really glad you brought up those aerial shots, because it really does. You are able to powerfully evoke a sense that this is a New York City film, even though it's a very universal story, and being able to, even though for a lot of the film we're in the tight space of a police cruiser, that we also have this sense that this connects to a very large system and a very large sort of series of interlocking human environments. So yeah, I really commend those choices.
Yeah, it was wonderful to see those guys on the street who had been victims of harassment by the policemen and feeling their victimness, and then going to that aerial view. That was wonderful. And one of the things that I was reminded of, Lieutenant, in your comments, I think they were your comments in the film, where you were speaking about the system in New York of quotas being like Ferguson on steroids. Did you say that? Because I was like, oh my God, because we had just done it at Harlem Stage, a piece on Antigone and Ferguson. So we had the choir that was there as a part of that production that went on free for 6 weeks. We had a choir that came from Ferguson that was made up of members of the police department, as well as the teachers who had worked with Michael Brown there before he was murdered and left in the street. So when you said that, it had such an impact for me, because that was the first time I understood that there was a monetary relationship between arrests and that injustice system. So when you said that, I was hoping that you could help me out and help us all to understand what the monetary system is that awards that level of arrest and arraignment, and sometimes imprisonment.
Yeah, sure. Well, imprisonment, that's the final step,
Yeah.
the important step. So summonses becoming dollars, that's pretty self-explanatory. You pay the summons, so the infraction has been monetized. But arrest is a little trickier. When you start arresting folks in their adolescent years, they get records that make it difficult for them to get proper employment. So they sometimes turn to alternative economies and all sorts of other ways to make ends meet, amongst other things that come with a socioeconomically challenged area. Once young folks continue to go through the system, eventually getting imprisoned, during the count for the census, they're counted as residents. They're counted as a residents of this towns that they're incarcerated in, not the areas that need the dollars more that they come from. So this is how every single arrest that compounds to the point where someone becomes state property becomes monetary, because a town like was Ossining, where Sing Sing is, the town's population is probably half of what the prison population is, but yet when it's time to distribute federal dollars, they get all the money for all the inmates and all the money for the people in town that they only have to spend on the people in town. So it's quite a scam. No matter, you bring it up in the state Senate, no one wants to talk about it, because it's, some of these towns, it's like the Walmart effect, where the prison is the main employer. So if you start talking about downsizing prisons and stopping this, the way that prisons turn into dollars, the elected official that brings that will not remain incumbent. So it's a very difficult issue to tackle, but we have to. It's hypocrisy to the Bill of Rights to have a system like this. As a nation that is young and, in a sense, an experiment of whether or not we can truly coincide. If we don't fix what's happening in the criminal justice system, then I don't see how we can get anything else done.
Thank you.
And it's obviously an ongoing effort, right? This is not something that is has an easy conclusion. And I think the film really wonderfully both has this, has the lawsuit as this compelling narrative frame that pushes it forward, but also doesn't provide, easy resolution. Like, okay, now we're done. Police is reformed. Criminal justice is better. Everything's going to be okay. So, given the fact that this is an ongoing effort, and we need to, have brave souls, if we're lucky enough, to continue to bear witness and testimony to this, how do you, for a project like this, I guess, Stephen, you can speak first, and I'd love to hear from you too, Lieutenant. How did you know when the film was done? How did you come up with a sense of conclusion to this ongoing effort? And then I'd love to hear, Lieutenant, where we are now and what's coming next.
Well, that was quite easy, but difficult to kind of construct in the edit. Essentially, this is obviously a problem that we had to let viewers understand was not resolved, and so the non-ending had to be the ending, which required, from a story structuring perspective, a need to kind of track long enough all the individual subjects so that we could arrive at kind of sub-endings that felt satisfying but still might compel viewers to a point of perhaps restlessness to go out and try and understand the issue more, understand what their next step might be if they were so inclined.
And I think you were going to answer that as well, I hope.
Just
Yeah.
run it by me again. Just
Where are we now?
okay. So
How these efforts are ongoing? Tell me.
yeah. Where we are in the film, you'll notice that parts of the lawsuit get dismissed, and it's quite a blow. To risk my life. Livelihood is one thing, but if anyone who knows about Frank Serpico, you understand that we're risking our lives. So when that happened, I realized we have to get more awareness to the issue. When the stop and frisk case was going on just 5 years ago, everyone knew something about it. Even if you didn't know it was called Floyd versus the City of New York, you've heard the term stop and frisk. You understood to a certain degree what it meant. This lawsuit, same federal lawsuit in the Southern District, and yet it's virtually unknown. I wish more people knew about this lawsuit so the powers that be, the status quo, can know that people are paying attention. Right now, we're still battling, in court litigation the department is trying to create this facade of change. I'm not gonna pull punches now. It's fraudulent. They understand they have to put up the veil that makes things seem different, especially with all this attention that NYPD 12 and the film has brought to the department. But things are still happening. One of the best things about being a public figure for this effort is many officers who don't have the courage to come forward. They find us, they tell us what's going on in their respective precincts. This is still a very real issue that's going on. So where we are, unfortunately, the issues continue to exist, and we're still trying to fight it in court.
We do know that the numbers of stop and frisk and the arrest have been reduced greatly, but we also know that it's still disproportionately directed to communities of color.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because today the department will sit and brag about those lower numbers, and they are in no moral position to do so, because their arm had to get bent via a lawsuit for that to happen. You don't get to claim the results when you fought with so much time and tax dollars to keep things the way they were. So yes, the numbers are lower, but that's the result of the federal lawsuit, not the department taking initiative from within.
What, can I add one thing? An interesting bit of data that the department put out themselves was that, on their website, in fact, was that in the last 2 quarters of 2017, if you look at the highest earning criminal summonsing or ticketing, essentially, that for high earners like, say, open container or marijuana possession, which cut across racial lines, as we know. Everyone smokes pot, everybody drinks out, in public sometimes. Blacks and Latinos were disproportionately targeted at a rate of over 5 times that of white communities for these high earners that cut straight across racial lines. That's in their own data. And that's something that we don't talk about. The city just has not had any conversation about, and it, is as recent as ongoing, in fact.
And I guess one of the final, and I know you've got some final words, but one of the things that we wanted to be able to understand is, what can we do? What is, in looking at this and understanding from you all where things are right now, what can we as citizens do that you're not seeing us do?
I'll start. So the executive of the city, the mayor, he was elected for this purpose. He's abandoned this mission. We have to get him back on track. If he was true to his word, then why fight us via the lawsuit? He did the right thing by dropping the appeal that Bloomberg started after the ruling for the stop and frisk lawsuit, and I respect him for that. But this is the continuation of that same fight. So to drop that appeal and yet continue to fight us, instead of saying, let's meet at the table, let's see how we can improve things, we have to put the pressure on the mayor's office. He's the executive of the city.
I actually called in to ask the mayor, and then I also reprised the conversation on Democracy Now!, where essentially he's on record having invited us in to meet with his senior staff and screen the film. I was told after the show that I would get an email or a correspondence from his team, and they never reached out. I called in again, they never reached out. So the mayor clearly is not interested in engaging this issue, and he needs to be pressured, just as Edwin said.
And how?
So if anybody knows the mayor, let him know.
Well, luckily, MAS knows a thing or two about putting pressure, maybe not so much for criminal justice reform, but certainly has a long tradition of 125 years of advocacy, which maybe there are some learnings there that can be shared across sector. But this is not just a New York City problem. Obviously, this is a national issue. And Lieutenant, in the quote that Pat mentioned about Ferguson on steroids, you talk about how New York City is really leading the way and by negative example for a lot of police departments across the country. I wonder. I mean, this film is screened. Obviously, it's streaming in living rooms around the country, but you've also had screenings in different contexts. How is this how do you see the national conversation changing? Not just sort of, we definitely need to keep putting the pressure on our own mayor's office, but there's a national story here to be told as well. Just tell me a little bit about how the film is played in other contexts, and then maybe we could end on the national picture of what we need to be thinking about.
Well, I'll just start. I mean, we've had countless law enforcement professionals come up to us after the film and say thank you for telling what is very similar to our story and what we're going through. And so a lot of people have expressed, an affinity for what the NYPD 12 and Edwin have been doing. Just in Prince George County in Maryland, a group of 13 officers called the PG-13, who were inspired by the NYPD 12, have formed their own class action lawsuit for similar grounds. So, we know that they're out there all over the country. And, it's our hope that more people talk about the film and that this conversation really does, find a new chapter, because, what Edwin represents and the 12 represent are a group of people who have never been invited to the table in the conversation of police reform, yet they are the ones who possess the most knowledge and the know-how to improve policing and law enforcement in this country.
Lieutenant, are departments talking to each other? Do you speak about, with your fellow officers in different jurisdictions? How do you see this conversation emerging beyond just New York City?
Yeah, in terms of police reform? Yeah, so many officers have reached out to me via either email or social media. And again, they say thanks. They tell me, share some anecdotes about what's going on where they work. But again, when your paycheck comes from the system, it's not, and you have other mouths to feed, it's not the most intelligent thing to challenge it. And, it creates apathy, and no one does anything about it, unfortunately, and it continues, perpetuates. But yeah, many, over 2,000 officers have contacted me from throughout the nation. It's been amazing, And another thing, this is part of the reason why how this ends up, the story of the NYPD 12 ends up, is crucial, because how we get solidified in history determines on whether or not others follow our footsteps. If we're decimated and steamrolled, it's going to be the reminder to other officers, let's not try anything, because remember what happened to those guys in New York. So we have to win this. We have to win this.
Thank you so much again for your continued advocacy along these lines. Before we wrap up, Stephen, I wanted, if you could just tell us a little bit about what's next for you. What is the next film we're going to be seeing? You just came back from the rainforest today. What are you working on there? And what are we going to be seeing next in your telling stories?
Yes, yeah, I've been filming a piece about illicit gold mining in South America, and how U.S. appetite for gold and drugs feeds the criminal supply chain, and U.S. verification is very weak for gold sourcing. So, that will be the next piece, and then also doing another film about our very fraught relationship to the idea of national identity, and a very broad kind of experimental piece on that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for giving voice to this level of activism and doing so in such a beautiful work of art that really is, as this particular award honors, a testament to New York City. In the citation of the award, it talks about the verve of the city, but I think there's also an aspect of that that really has a lot to do with the culture of truth-telling and speaking truth to power, and giving voice to that through art, and lifting up a platform. Activists and whistleblowers like yourself, Lieutenant, I think is a fitting thing that I think Brendan Gill would be proud of. What do you think, Pat?
I absolutely agree, and we look forward to the next work and to your continued activism and to our engagement in that activism. Thank you so much.
Please join me in congratulating again Stephen Maing, winner of the Brendan Gill Prize.